Hello, my name is Konrad, and the title of my presentation is Streets Could Be Our Main Stage, the appropriation of street space by bikes. The empirical research I'm presenting today was done during a one-year research project in 2018, titled Die Straße, ein Stadtraum in Bewegung, the street and urban space in motion, which was part of the master's program in European Ethnology at the University of Graz in Austria. I'm currently in the process of writing my master's thesis, in which I focus on the conflict surrounding the topics of street space, biking, and gender. As Joshua Switzky points out, streets are our largest and most important piece of public space in the city. They account up to 30% of the total surface area of the city. Yet we consider them only as afterthoughts. Streets are everyone's open space. We fret and tussle over every precious inch of our grassy parks, yet we overlook the massive wasted public space right outside each of our front doors, accessible to each and every residence. Streets could be our main stage. Yes, streets could be our main stage. Once a month, during critical mass rides, this becomes reality. It is difficult to determine what exactly a critical mass is, because it comes in many different forms. What every critical mass has in common is that persons come together to ride their bicycles in a city as a form of protest against car traffic or to fight for better cycling opportunities in the city. Usually, people meet at a certain place at a certain time and then start riding together. At a critical mass, there are no responsible persons or applicants. Officially, the participants meet by chance. Official registration is deliberately avoided since participation in road traffic as a road user does not require a permit, and because it is only possible to carry out a critical mass in a non-hierarchical and self-organized manner, thus without registration. Also, there is no planned route. The cyclists at the front of the critical mass decide in what direction it goes. In practice, critical masses can look very different, from 16 participants to several thousand, really blocking car traffic or just symbolically using a lane, spreading radical content or civilly protesting for more bike paths. It's not a homogeneous movement, since participants have very different opinions and missions. The first critical mass took place in 1992 in San Francisco. In 1994, it had already spread to dozens of other American cities. Now, critical masses occur in nearly every major Western city. Here you can see a picture of a critical mass in Prague in 2007. Here you can see a critical mass ride in Linz, Austria. David Graeber defines critical mass as a form of direct action. Direct action aims to confront what it sees as an unjust or illegitimate form of authority in a way that, in its very internal structure, suggests a viable alternative to it. Let me introduce the 6 people I got to know and talk to while conducting an ethnographic method called participant observation, which I used while taking part in critical mass rides. I was able to do qualitative interviews with these 6 people in July and August 2018. The bike messenger Emil probably spends more time on the street than anyone else because of his job. The student Laura is very interested in geography and sustainable urban development. The social worker Anna finds that too many regulations restrict free thinking. The environmental system scientist Emma has been studying on how our living spaces can be made more sustainable since her bachelor's degree. The computer scientist and artist Alex sold his car many years ago, questions the obvious and finds revolutionary potential in the critical mass movement. Last but not least, the psychology student Marie likes the feeling of power she gets during the critical mass over automobile traffic, and believes that the quality of life in Graz would be increased massively if fewer cars were allowed in the city. These 6 people have quite similar reasons for riding during a critical mass. Anna especially emphasized the fun and the sense of community while riding with the group. Most of them told me their reason for participation is aimed at raising awareness. All of them cycle a lot in their everyday lives, which is why the topic is important to them. Alex emphasized that he likes being able to practice a form of self-empowerment during the critical mass rites. He believes that critical masses encourage peaceful appropriation not only of the street, but also in other areas of life. But back to the research question. How does the critical mass movement transform street space by appropriating it in an alternative way? According to the French Marxist sociologist and intellectual Henri Lefebvre, space can not only be described physically and materially, but is also constructed socially. Urban space is thus constantly being redefined in theory and practice. It is a result of debate about access and participation in renewal and redefinition. How a space, including street space, is perceived, how it is designed, and what meaning is ascribed to it, not to mention how it is used, is a constant process that always depends on power structures and knowledge production. The production of public space is an area of conflict between two major actors. On the one hand, state and capital, and on the other, subordinate groups. These subordinate groups try to acquire public space for their own use, and are mostly driven by very different, often conflicting interests. A distinction can be made between two major conflicting movements. The state and economic groups implement authority through and in space. They create controllable space and try to shape it. The social subordinate groups have limited power and in part revolt against their powerlessness, addressing and criticizing social contradictions. This creates counterspaces and counter-publicity. The cultural anthropologist Johanna Rolshofen developed a spatial triad that connects people in urban space, history, and society with the constructed material space. Her model establishes the street as a space of representation, including the social and historical attribution of that space. It takes into account the experience space, that is the space perceived by the individual and mediated in everyday life, as well as the material space, that is the measurable, architecturally created space containing materialized ideology. By orienting my investigations based on Johanna Rolshofen's spatial triad, there are some necessary considerations regarding street space in connection with the critical mass movement. What's the space of representation? What are the social and historical attributes of the street? Johanna Rolshofen states that the space of representation is the space for ideologically guided action, the space for social conventions, systems, and structures. In this regard, the StVO Road Traffic Act is greatly relevant for the topic of critical mass in Austria. The rules of conduct laid down in these regulations aim to make motorized traffic move as quickly as possible and establish the right-of-way of cars on the road and in traffic. Unfortunately, a closer look of the emergence of these regulations would go beyond the extent of this presentation. It will suffice to say that these developments began in the 19th century, as my research confirms. The next major change was brought about by the Reichsstraßenverkehrsordnung, Reich Road Traffic Act of 1934, which played an important role in further cementing the dominance of motorized vehicles on the road. Next to road building and motorization policies of the National Socialists, this act and its revision in 1937 aimed to realize the Volksmotorisierung, motorization of the German people. The automobile played an important role in Nazi propaganda, and following their rise to power, it became a clear symbol of the social changes that the new political system strove for. Under Hitler, the car became a symbol of progress and economic growth brought about by the new regime. The government invested heavily in the national car industry. The dominance of cars on the street was ensured, and road users were increasingly hierarchized. After the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II, the changes in traffic policy regarding the prioritization of motor vehicles made during that period were nonetheless maintained, and the social attribution of the street as a space solely for motorized traffic is still predominant today. It's pretty clear what makes up the material space of the street. A street has a certain width, is made of a certain material, in better or worse condition, has traffic markings, etc. Street space as an experience space that contains the everyday practices of road use, or the internalized action, so to speak. Drivers steer their cars exactly where they should, cyclists ride on the edge of the road, pedestrians only cross the street at the crosswalk, parking spaces should normally only be used for cars, and so on. During the evaluation of my interviews, I found that the critical mass participants criticized each of the three aspects of the spatial street triad I described. They criticized the representation of the street, saying, the car doesn't really bring freedom, except in the rarest of cases actually. Like, these images of freedom are generated again and again in advertising, for example. These pictures should be reinterpreted and alternatives need to be pointed out. Alex. You can read more examples below. They criticized material street space, saying, I live at the end of the Heinrichstraße, and most of all, I want to say that the street is in a really bad condition. The asphalt is totally cracked. Marie. And they criticized the experience of street space, saying, why shouldn't you play soccer in the Grazbachgasse, or tennis, or skate? Alex. The material street space is appropriated during the critical mass, and the materialized ideology is temporarily ignored, for example lanes, red traffic lights, etc. The experienced street space acts as a stage for the direct action. The experience of street space is temporarily changed by the appropriation of the built space by the bicycles. For the cyclists, who now take up more space and can move more freely, for the motorists, who have to slow down, and for the pedestrians and residents, who find the scene of the street completely changed also in regard to noise. The representation of the street, that is the social and historical attributions of the street, the space of ideologically guided action, remains. Though the other two spatial aspects are temporarily transformed by the critical mass, no immediate change seems to be possible in the representation of the street. However, since the three spatial aspects are in a constant dynamic relationship to each other, transformation of this area must be perceived as a long-term process. In the short term, critical mass cannot do anything against the dominance of motorized private transportation on the street. Nevertheless, as Moravsky notes, presence in space is a good starting point for publicly communicating protest, and thus also for appropriating the symbolic aspect of space. It is absolutely possible to join a critical mass without knowing about its political implications. Direct actions, like critical mass, is not meant to be for public relations, and most of the time media presence is avoided. The goal is to build up activist culture and community, and to see what happens if a certain logic is carried as far as it can go. In this case, as David Graeber points out, it is the utopian element of direct action, particularly the emphasis on collective pleasure that is pushed to the limit. As far as confrontation goes, the target is an abstraction. Car culture, the control of public space, or, in a larger sense, the entire system of social alienation and constraint that denies us the opportunity for self-realization, creativity, and fun. The primary goal of critical mass can't be understood as the realization of concrete demands, demonstration on the street once a month for the implementation of those demands. It is more about temporarily gaining control over the situation and turning the idea of street space dominated by bicycles instead of motorized transportation into a reality, even if only for a short time. To put it in Adam Kessel's world, critical mass's radical nature lies in its process. It is a means of moving, not a particular destination. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. You can find my email on the first slide. Thank you.